You are listening to Metal Girl Solid, one woman's journey through a series she knows nothing about. I am the titular Metal Girl, Courtney Colson, and welcome to our first Intel Files episode. There was just so much to discuss about the conversation between the boss and Snake that it was never going to fit into a regular episode, so this is why I have created the Intel Files series, which will be additional episodes focusing on a singular topic. And I wanted to give the boss her due attention, so here it is. The challenge was that this conversation brought up so many things at the heart of this series. The philosophical discussions on what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be an enemy in absolute terms, the times, what it means to be loyal to the end. And then, of course, there is the very crucial foundation I have yet to establish, the Cold War. This story is so steeped in the true events of the Cold War, and the lives of these characters are so intertwined with those events that in order to fully appreciate Metal Gear, you need to have a basic understanding of the major events of not just this, but I think the 20th century. So here, I am going to, as briefly as I can, summarize the Cold War, a decades-long, very complicated, international, multinational conflict, but here we go. As with any historical event, deciding where it begins and ends, what is irrelevant, what is relevant, is subjective. History is told by people placing a narrative over events in retrospect. The Cold War grows out of the events of World War II. It's a direct response to it. For the sake of brevity, I am not going into too much depth about World War II itself, but I will begin with the events rather that take place immediately following or kind of towards the end of the Second World War. So it's like this. Entire nations can function not unlike individual people. And after the years of World War II, everyone is tired, worn down, on edge. This is reflected in all aspects of life, from the civilians to the politicians. We were all once united against a common enemy, but once the Nazis were overthrown, we soon turned on each other. We see the world split into two, not just the USA and USSR. You see this in East Germany, West Germany, North Korea, South Korea, NATO, Warsaw. It is a global splitting on a macro and micro level. If you've seen Oppenheimer, you will understand that the Manhattan Project, the project that gave the world the atomic bomb, began during the Second World War. And it's perfectly understandable why the United States would want to build the ultimate game-over weapon. After facing the devastation of World War II, it's perfectly natural that they would want to prevent such a thing ever happening again. The only problem is, no one man should have all that power, and in so creating a weapon meant to protect them from superpowered enemies, they created them. And so it was in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference. Harry Truman informed then-ally Joseph Stalin of the successful launch of the Trinity test. Stalin didn't act too surprised, which unnerved Truman. Turns out Stalin knew because he'd already been informed by spies of America's first successful nuclear detonation. The Soviets had been a mighty ally in World War II. Even the Nazis feared them. Operation Barbarossa is a spectacular example of the Nazis underestimating their enemy and the sheer strength of the Soviet army. The Nazis were completely unprepared for the severity of the Russian winter, nor were they able to compete with the unending Russian reinforcements. The Russians had them far outnumbered and weren't afraid to keep throwing men at the problem until it stopped. But now, upon seeing what the United States were capable of, the Soviets began creating their own atomic weapons in response, just in case. It was the beginning of a standoff that still stands to this day. And it was in January 1946, so not long after the Trinity test at all. The UN Atomic Energy Commission already were discussing eliminating nuclear weapons. Immediately, the world knew this was too much. The people who created this weapon, Oppenheimer, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. This is godlike power that is terrifying. And I remember as a child finding the very notion of atomic weapons unspeakably terrifying. I couldn't imagine or believe that we could do such a thing. You know, I was that weird kid who would get military books out from the library, and I would look at the effect on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, seeing the remains of human beings, the shadows blasted onto walls for all eternity, and reading about the slow death of radiation sickness. I mean, to this day, it is one of the scariest things in the world to me. And, you know, this could easily lead me to branch out into a discussion on mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence. It could also lead me to go on another tangent about how impossible peace is on a global scale, as human beings don't have a unified vision of peace, and fundamentally we do not and cannot trust each other. I really could go on a half-hour tangent about this, but I am showing great restraint, and I'm saving all of that for Peace Walker. I did actually write it, I did record it, and then I just went, Jesus Christ, I'm going to be here forever. I got to stop somewhere. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was created, and this is an American foreign policy that pledges American support for democracies against authoritarian threats, essentially an attempt to contain the Soviet expansion. This would later become the basis for NATO. This doctrine resulted in the United States intervening in such communist uprisings as the ones in Greece, Iran, and Turkey. So, having briefly mentioned NATO and the Warsaw Pact, I shall go into more depth about those because that is essentially the foundation or the center of the Cold War. And I'll be quoting from the book Communism in Transition here.
When Britain and the United States allowed West Germany to issue its own currency, the Soviets saw it as a plot to rebuild a powerful capitalist Germany that might again threaten the Soviet Union. Stalin, in a power move, responded by blockading access to Berlin to back his demands that the Western powers give the Soviets a veto on German recovery. President Truman, assisted by Great Britain, countered with the 1984 airlift to Berlin over the Russian zone of occupation. Meanwhile, Western Europe felt threatened by the Berlin blockade and the communist coup in Czechoslovakia. It organized the Brussels Pact, which later became a core of the Northern Atlantic Treaty, NATO, joined by the United States. The Soviets belatedly realized that the Berlin blockade was stimulating the alliance process, and they lifted the blockade in spring of 1949. It was too late to stop the momentum for NATO, and on July 21, 1949, the Senate ratified the Northern Atlantic Treaty. In the fall, a provisional West German government was established. The final step of arming West Germany did not take place until more than 5 years later. Again, the Soviets sped the process along by supporting the Korean War in 1950. At the same time, they were secretly forming a paramilitary force in East Germany, which later was converted to military units for the Warsaw Pact. There was a reluctance, particularly in France, to rearm Western Germany, but when the Soviets gave the signal in the Korean War that communism would commit aggression where there was weakness, this alarmed leaders of the West. They accelerated the rearming of Germany. At the end of 1954, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden proposed to expand the Brussels Treaty, France, Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, to take in West Germany and Italy. To calm French fears, Britain agreed to maintain 4 British divisions in Germany along with a tactical air force. The United States also committed forces in Germany. As part of this deal, the German Chancellor signed the ABC Agreement, which committed Germany, along with Benelux countries, not to make atomic, bacteriological, or chemical weapons. Germany regained sovereignty and joined NATO in 1955. A few days later, the Soviets concluded the Warsaw Pact of 1955 with the Eastern European satellite countries as a balance of power response. The preamble of the Warsaw Pact makes clear that the entry of West Germany into NATO was the rationale for the pact. All the Eastern European countries were members of the pact except Yugoslavia and Albania. It was a mutual defense treaty, reinforced by bilateral treaties between members.
And so the Warsaw Pact and the resultant separation of the Eastern Bloc would be illustrated by the metaphorical Iron Curtain. Never before has the world seen a conflict as strange and complex as the Cold War. And this is why I find it infinitely fascinating. It's the period of military history I'm most drawn to. In what other war was there no direct conflict between the warring factions? And don't get me wrong, proxy wars are nothing new. But there has never been anything on the scale of the Cold War, and the motivation was unique. In the past, a proxy war was basically, you've got a third party backing one of the belligerents is the official term. Backing one of the belligerents because they stand to gain something out of it. It's like backing a horse in a race, basically. Whereas in the case of the Cold War, it is a proxy war because if the USA and the USSR really went head to head, nobody wins. They both have equal nuclear capability. And the Warsaw Pact and NATO meant that this conflict was not just between these two nations, but their gathered allies. It was these two equally deadly sides. And it cannot be coincidence that the year following the creation of NATO, the Korean War broke out in 1950, with the Soviets backing North Korea and the Americans backing South Korea. Stalin died a few months before the Korean War ended, and briefly, Georgy Malenkov took over, and then Nikita Khrushchev became the next leader of the Soviet Union. So at this very moment, while Snake is in the USSR, this is August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is going down in Vietnam. And this was the moment where the United States got much more directly involved in the Vietnam War. Up until that point, it had been all covert operations, and like this one, it was a covert amphibious operation. It wasn't intended to be any sort of direct conflict, but they were in the North Vietnamese waters, they were caught, and that escalated things into full-on war. So I'm just going to quickly run through everything else that goes down in the Cold War up until 1964, the time of Snake Eater. I will be reading from the website History on the Net. Summer 1954 was the Geneva Accords. This set of documents ended the French War with the Viet Minh and divided Vietnam into North and South states. The communist leader of the North Vietnamese was Ho Chi Minh, while the US-friendly South was led by Ngo Dinh Diem. And hopefully I pronounced that right. I had to look it up. Isn't it funny? We know the enemy's name, Ho Chi Minh. I mean, he's repeated many, many times in many war movies, but Ngo Dinh Diem, hopefully I'm saying that right. Very hard to say. But Ngo Dinh Diem? First time I ever said it or heard it out loud. And he was assassinated in a coup in 1963, same year as Kennedy. May 14th, 1955 was the Warsaw Pact. November 1st, 1957 was when the USSR put Sputnik II, which carried Like the Dog, the first living creature, into space. 1960, Paris East and West talks between Nikita Khrushchev and Dwight Eisenhower concerning the fate of Germany broke down when a USA U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russian airspace. So that incident is probably the most famous example of US spy activity in Russian territory. I don't think we need to focus too much on the U-2 spy plane incident itself, but if you are aware of it, or, as I've just mentioned, the Tonkin incident, anytime spies are found, it causes an international incident. It really escalates things. So when Snake is being told about the severity of his mission and that he has to go in alone, he has to procure on site, he's going to get no assistance whatsoever. Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. That is probably what many spies had to face. April the 12th, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space. And then just about a week later, and then I think that would be the same week, April the 17th, 1961, was the Bay of Pigs invasion, a force of Cuban exiles trained by the CIA, aided by the US government, attempted to invade Cuba and overthrow the communist government of Fidel Castro. The attempt failed. And we will definitely talk more about Fidel Castro and also El Che in Peace Walker, so we'll keep that brief. August the 13th, 1961, the Berlin Wall is built and divides East and West Germany. And related was the Berlin Wall crisis, which was a brief standoff between the US and Russian tanks at Checkpoint Charlie. Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to resolve the conflict peacefully and withdraw, but that was a moment where the Cold War could have become very hot indeed. It'll be hotter than Cuba. Speaking of, October 14th, 1962, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. A US spy plane reported sighting the construction of a Soviet nuclear missile base in Cuba. President Kennedy set up a naval blockade and demanded the removal of the missiles. War was averted when the Russians agreed on the 28th of October to remove the weapons. The United States agreed not to invade Cuba. November 22nd, 1963, was the JFK assassination. And much has been made about the Kennedy assassination. To this day, people are still discussing, was it a lone killer, or was there communist or CIA complicity? And yeah, of course, I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marine. So he had the training, he could do it. But why? It could just be, PTSD, he was a soldier, he saw some shit, changed his allegiances. But because it was just at such an intense time in the Cold War, it was such an opportune moment that it's hard to just think, oh, it was just a loner. It was just some crazed man. No. And I am definitely on the side of there's got to be something bigger at play here. I think he was, Lee Harvey Oswald, for all we know, could have been like the boss, who used to be a soldier, perhaps a respected soldier, who is used as the fall guy, a sacrifice, the scapegoat. And I mean, I can't go too much on a tangent about, I gotta stay focused, but if you would like to go more in depth on this, I will link to a fantastic video by fantastic channel, Let Me Know, on YouTube. He goes well into depth and it's a very well produced documentary. On October 15th, 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was removed from office and he's replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. So that is just after the events of Snake Eater, which, according to the wiki page, was August 30th to September 2nd, 1964. And as far as we can tell, those real-world events that happened post-Snake Eater really did happen within the world of Metal Gear. So the rest of Khrushchev's life in the real world happens in Metal Gear. It gets very confusing. And then July 1965 is when the Vietnam War truly began. I mean, it began in the 50s, but it was in July of 1965 that 150,000 US troops were sent to Vietnam. So I'll stop there, because that's basically all we need to know at this point in time. And now on to the boss.
Speaking of snakes, you remember the boss, don't you? A legendary soldier and your mentor. Actually, it was the boss that got the DCI's authorization in the first place. She's going to be serving as Fox's mission advisor.
The boss is?
She also helped me plan this mission. She and I were at SAS together.
I've observed the discussions amongst Metal Gear fans on Reddit and YouTube and many other places, and the interpretations of the characters can vary so wildly. It fascinates me, especially with characters like the boss or Ocelot, whose allegiances are dubious. You really have to pay very close attention, look at all the evidence to come to any semblance of a conclusion. These are games that challenge our relationship with the truth, so I think it helps to break things down line by line in this conversation. So first of all, DCI, I think, is Director of Central Intelligence. At this stage, it is my belief that the boss is being honest here. We know she's involved in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, as I said. Sometime after this, Sokolov asked her to defect to the west, and in order to accomplish this, they call in the best to assist the boss. So I believe all of that is true.
Jack, is that you? How many years has it been?
Boss?
That's right. It's me.
Oh.
Talk to me. Let me hear your voice.
It's been 5 years, 72 days, and 18 hours.
You've lost weight.
You can tell just by the sound of my voice.
Of course I can. I know all about you.
Really?
I always feel this makes Snake seem naive. Surely the boss has just read his file. She can't just tell how much he weighs based on his voice. But maybe there's a point here, conveying just how much Snake blindly trusts the boss, as a child does his mother. Here's what we know about the relationship, quoting from the Metal Gear Wiki here. Born in 1935, Jack's military career dated back to the 1950s, becoming the boss's disciple in June 1950 when the Korean War began. Snake was just 15 years old when he enlisted and likely took another man's life for the first time. And having read Marlantes' book, What It Is Like to Go to War, Marlantes discusses his psychology as a young adult soldier in Vietnam, and I'll insert a clip here.
So ask the now 20-year-old combat veteran at the gas station how he felt about killing someone. His probable angry answer, if honest, not a fucking thing. Ask him when he's 60, and if he's not too drunk to answer, it might come out very differently, but only by luck of circumstance. Who was there to help him with the feelings those 4 long decades after coming home from war? It is critical for young people who return from combat that someone is there to help them before they turn to drugs, alcohol, and suicide. We cannot expect a normal 18-year-old to kill someone and contain it in a healthy way. They must be helped to sort out what will be healthy grief about taking a life because it is part of the sorrow of war. The drugs, alcohol, and suicides are ways of avoiding guilt and fear of grief. Grief itself is a healthy response.
And why I mention this is because Marlantes says these boys need guidance to deal with the psychological toll of their actions. And I believe the boss must have played that role for Snake. Deprived of the boss, he has no one to guide him through his feelings. And sadly, the other people he confides in will end up turning on him too, sooner or later. Except Ocelot, maybe? I'm hoping Ocelot and Big Boss remain friends forever. We shall see. That's another thought. So who did Ocelot have to confide in? That's a topic for another time, but I am fascinated by what little we know of Ocelot's upbringing. We will do a whole episode on Gru. I promise we will.
Well, I don't know anything about you.
What's that supposed to mean?
Why'd you disappear on me all of a sudden?
I was on a top-secret mission.
We don't know for certain what the boss was doing after she left Snake. The wiki says from 1959 she was in Russia to recruit those against the single-party regime and to steal information on their space program. However, there is no citation as to where this information comes from, and I mean, I've played this game many times, so I don't recall it. Has the boss been in the USSR since 1959? Well, that can't be right. We know she was in Cuba in 1961. So okay, maybe after the Bay of Pigs she goes undercover in Russia. Okay, I can accept that. We don't know when Volgan acquires the Philosopher's Legacy, but that is the entire reason for this mission. The boss isn't going to Russia other than to retrieve this very important thing, the Philosopher's Legacy. Now, is it the Philosophers sending her in? You know, all this stuff, I have been playing this game and researching it and writing these scripts for years. And I still think of new things, but yeah, okay. Was this just a plot by the United States, or was this Philosophers, or both, or are they working against each other? Because the Philosophers are the United States, and Russia, and China. Sorry, I've just been driven mad by the complexity and insanity of Kojima's work. But, okay, I'm going to look at the wiki. During the 1960s, the United States Department of Defense began to feel threatened by the CIA's growing influence in military affairs, especially in reference to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the covert ops in North Vietnam and the Metal Gear project, as in Chegahod? Or no, I should know about that, I guess. So I don't know about... okay, and then in portable ops, by 1970s... the internal power struggles, and Zero and Ocelot decide to reform the philosophers. It's mentioning Gene as the character from Portable. Okay, alright. But, canonically, the Kojima written stuff, okay, that would be Zero ended the philosophers and led the reorganized American philosophers to continue the omnipotence over the American government and way of life, which is, Patriots, I think. Okay, this is getting outside of my territory. So, who ordered the boss to do this? Because if it's the philosophers, then the Russians know. So then the plot doesn't work. Oh my god. I'm getting vertigo here, man. Okay, getting back on track. Volgan acquires the philosopher's legacy. The philosophers still exist at this point, so they'd be freaking out about it. Right, and as we know, China also gets involved. Spoilers, with Eva. Everyone's trying to get this MacGuffin. They're trying to get the philosopher's legacy. Alright? Another thought occurs to me is, why don't the philosophers unite to retrieve the legacy? And why is all their money in one easily stealable MacGuffin? Realistically, it would be more of a case of each nation pledging a certain amount of money to the cause, and then when funding is required for a specific project, the parties negotiate and decide which projects to fund and for how much and for how long. Whereas how it stands, and of course this is cartoon, fictional spy nonsense, but what you have now is, well, all the money has been stolen. So now everyone, all these nations, see it as this prime opportunity to grab all that money for themselves. Whereas if all the funding behind the philosophers was just theoretical, so, the United States has pledged $1 billion, and China, $1.5 billion, and, they have this amount of money allocated in their GDP annually for this secret project. I almost feel like it's actually Khrushchev who is out of the loop. I don't know. Oh, God. We can say nothing conclusively, but it's nice to think about it. It's just a little fun thought experiment, but we know Volgan has the philosopher's legacy. That is a bad thing. So the boss, the most badass soldier that ever lived, had to be sent in to acquire it. Okay, fair enough. Fair dinkum. Got it. And then, when Snake encounters the boss again, she's giving Volgan the Davy Crockett, which is a hell of an offering. That's a hell of an offering. If she's only playing an undercover role. It certainly shows she's serious, but that is not something an undercover operative would ever do. It is simply insane. The former CIA agent, Amaryllis Fox, says that when she was going undercover, she would claim to be interested in buying or selling nuclear weapons, and then wait to see who comes a-knocking. And then it's her job to make friends with these people and try to dissuade them or even recruit them. She actually didn't mention arresting people that often. Usually she was recruiting them. And it was interesting to see the kinds of people who would try to purchase a nuclear weapon. And a lot of them just seemed like desperate civilians trying to get their country back from dictators. But Volgan is not one of those men. So, the boss's actions here further serve to confuse us. Has she seriously defected or not? As far as we can tell, Volgan didn't specifically request the Davy Crockett. It was the boss's idea. She wasn't pushed into this. Running with this interpretation, somehow she was able to steal the experimental nuclear weapons from the United States and bring them to the Soviet Union without anyone noticing. Also, somehow, she is able to carry the weapon and its shells, which supposedly the combined total weight is about 300 kilos or 700 pounds in American scales. Metal Gear can be brilliantly accurate or brilliantly silly sometimes. There is no middle ground, so I cannot dismiss this interpretation. It could be true. It could be valid. I don't know. I am losing my mind here, people. Can you tell? I love these games so much. They're so good. So, get more serious now. I've always found it tragic that such a legendary hero as the boss is disregarded like this. Although now, I'm starting to think, well, okay, on the one hand, she chose to arm the enemy with a nuclear weapon. What did she think was going to happen? That's absurd. But, okay, from a dramatic standpoint, of course, it works very well. It's a big, dramatic, explosive plot point. It convinces us, absolutely, that the boss has defected. Certainly convinces Volgan. Not to skip ahead to Peace Walker, but I'm going to skip ahead to Peace Walker. It's kind of essential here. Retroactively, we are given a new perspective on these events. The former CIA official, Hot Coleman, great name, claims he orchestrated Operation Snake Eater. This changes everything. It means that the United States gave the boss the Davy Crockett. It means she was supposed to give it to Volgan. He was expected to launch the nukes and incite an international incident. Then, when Khrushchev confronted him, President Johnson was supposed to claim innocence, and by being willing to kill such a well-regarded hero as the boss, Khrushchev would never suspect a thing. I mean, who would believe that America would be willing to put that kind of soldier on the sacrificial table? It had to be the boss. If they had just picked a random soldier, it wouldn't have been as convincing. And that is tragic, if that is how it is. But I don't know. Hot Coleman had, as far as we know, had nothing to do with Virtuous Mission. Virtuous Mission pertained only to Sokolov. So then where does the boss come into that? Well, because she is defecting or pretending to defect, obviously she's there with the Cobras and Volgan to take Sokolov. He's a valuable asset to them. Okay. If Volgan hadn't used the Davy Crockett, and I'll go more into the conversation between Johnson and Khrushchev when that occurs in the story, but essentially, Khrushchev contacts Johnson because OKB 754, Sokolov's research facility, was destroyed in a nuclear explosion. But that wasn't the problem. At the same time, the Soviet anti-aircraft radar picked up a signature that appeared to come from a United States military aircraft. So that must have been the one Zero and Paramedic and SIGINT are in, I presume. That couldn't have been anything else. So it's not that it was the Davy Crockett. It doesn't seem that Khrushchev is aware of what kind of weapon destroyed the research facility. So that then suggests if Snake and his support crew were not in Soviet territory at the time of that incident, this wouldn't have happened. I mean, Operation Snake Eater probably was already devised and already waiting in the wings. This probably would have had to have happened anyway. It's a contingency. Operation Snake Eater is the contingency plan that if a United States activity is detected in Soviet territory, then President Johnson can simply turn around and say, oh, yes, that was the boss, and she's defected. So if not now, when? When would they have had to enacted Operation Snake Eater? So it was, in that regard, inevitable. So excluding this particular incident, is there anything else that happens in the plot of this game that would indict the United States in the eyes of the Soviet Union? I mean, obviously at the end, Snake's activities, destroying the Shagohod and all of that, yes. But removing Snake from the plot, yeah, so that's kind of tragic. If you removed Snake from this story, the woman he loved more than anyone in the whole wide world would probably be alive. It's your fault, Snake. Well, no, that's victim blaming. It's Volgan's fault. It's always Volgan's fault. Just in general, if anything goes wrong in life, it's Volgan's fault. As far as we know, Kojima did not have any of this in mind when he created Snake Eater, nor had it even dreamed up the likes of Hot Coleman or Skullface yet. Therefore, I presented you with both versions of reality. Is this our simulation simulacra of the episode? I've had a few listeners say to me, well, of course, if you play it in chronological order, it's going to seem like everything was planned and there is a cohesive narrative here. And, okay, sure, a lot of this is done or rewritten in retrospect. But it's kind of interesting to approach it that way and see how well, or maybe it doesn't, fit together.
You didn't need me anymore.
But there were still so many things I wanted you to teach me.
No, I taught you everything you needed to know about fighting techniques. I taught you all I could. The rest you needed to learn on your own.
Techniques, sure. But what about how to think like a soldier?
How to think like a soldier? I can't teach you that. A soldier needs to be strong in spirit, body, and technique. And the only thing you can learn from someone else is technique. In fact, technique doesn't even matter. What's most important is spirit. Spirit and body are like two sides of a single coin. They're the same thing. I can't teach you how to think. You'll just have to figure it out for yourself. Listen to me, Jack. Just because soldiers are on the same side right now doesn't mean they always will be. Having personal feelings about your comrades is one of the worst sins you can commit. Politics determine who you face on the battlefield. And politics are a living thing. They change along with the times. Yesterday's good might be tomorrow's evil.
Quote from my good mate, Gray here. I think the part of her philosophy that bothers me most is how it's sinful to care about your fellow soldiers because they might be the enemy one day. You can't turn people into heartless machines. They have to care about their comrades. By creating this paradox for Snake, she set him up to become a villain. And I didn't even initially notice this detail in the conversation. And I wasn't sure if I really agreed with Gray's point, but no, yeah, I can see what she's talking about. So here is a quote from SOG about the relationship between soldiers. Medal of Honor recipient Bob Howard explained,
"It's kind of hard to put into words, but it's like having somebody that you love. If you served in SOG and you were willing to die, you wanted to have a person there you would not mind dying for or dying with. A lot of people don't understand that. There was great assurance in looking over, narrowed-eyed and tense, your thumb easing the car 15 safety off to see your partner's eyes just the same, both knowing that no matter the fury about to be unleashed, he would not run off and leave you, nor would you leave him. That's not cheap talk. When 10 times as many NVA as anyone should reasonably fight suddenly appear, eons of evolution and every bit of common sense screams run. Afraid? Beyond words. But you stay and fight. Leaving behind a live wounded man was all but inconceivable, but teammates forced each other to vow not to risk their lives for their dead bodies. Yes, SOG teams left American bodies if they had to. Better that than give their foe more lives. To give such an order, and I've given the command myself, leaves no remorse, just regret at its necessity. SOG survivors always felt they carried their teammates' spirit back with them. Devotion to mission was an ethic too. A recon man's duty was to accomplish his mission and survive in that order.
So as we can see, it is important to have that camaraderie in battle. It is not a sin to care for your fellow soldier. That's too simplistic. Instead, you must love your crew as if they were your family. But if they are killed, if they defect, you have to remain professional. The mission comes first. If anyone should understand this, it's the boss. And maybe she did, once. This entire conversation is between two heartbroken people. The boss seems cold here, but it's because she's trying to kill any part of her that feels in order to make the greatest sacrifice of all. This is her saying goodbye.
Is that why you abandoned me?
No, it had nothing to do with you. I already told you, Jack. I was on a top-secret mission. A soldier has to follow whatever orders he's given. It's not his place to question why. But you're looking for a reason to fight. You're a natural-born fighter, but you're not quite a soldier. A soldier is a political tool, nothing more. That's doubly true if he's a career soldier. Right and wrong have no place in his mission. He has no enemies and no friends. Only the mission. You follow the orders you're given. That's what being a soldier is.
Snake is looking for a reason to fight. And that is one of the most crucial things a soldier needs. Marlantes discusses this at length in What It Is Like to Go to War. It's a huge focus in the book, but I will just quote one passage here in Chapter 3, Guilt.
Warriors will always have to deal with guilt and mourning. It is unfortunate that the guilt and mourning resides almost entirely with those asked to do the dirty work. Choosing to fight for the right reasons can assuage this guilt. Mourning can lessen it. But every warrior or erstwhile warrior will need to understand that just like rucksack, ammunition, water, and food, guilt and mourning will be one of the things they carry. They will shoulder it all for the society they fight for.
So, no, soldiers cannot just be tools. They can't become robots. They are thinking, feeling human beings who need to believe in the cause. This is why the soldiers of World War II had an easier time adjusting to life after the war, as opposed to the soldiers of Vietnam. Not only did the World War II soldiers believe absolutely that they were the heroes fighting the villains, but society did too. Soldiers of Vietnam were not celebrated as heroes when they returned home, because the civilians saw what they were doing, and many of these soldiers came to realize the futility of the war they had been set to fight. And this is why we get so many philosophically confronting stories like Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and Full Metal Jacket. These are stories about a pointless proxy war, about this superpowered nation going up against these simple villages in Vietnam. The ludicrousness of it. And this is why it is far more nihilistic than many of the other conflicts of the 20th century. Does Snake experience guilt? We've never really seen him express remorse in any of these games, except when he had to kill the boss. And I think this says something significant about the psychology of Big Boss, of Naked Snake. Having been a child soldier, did he fully grapple with the consequences of his actions? Or did he just see the man on the other end of his rifle as the target? This is his job, nothing more. He maybe didn't see them as human beings, couldn't allow himself to. He doesn't seem to take joy in killing, and the purpose of this mission in Snake Eater is to avoid violence, and every successive game is built on that same principle. But it isn't until he is forced to kill the boss that it suddenly turns his world upside down. And I don't just think that is because it was someone he loved very much. I honestly believe this is the first time he has looked into his enemy's eyes and seen a human being and known who that human being was and loved her. That has got to be devastating. Of course that changes you. And so we will see this warrior poet emerge, especially in Peace Walker, where Snake is suddenly contemplating the full scope of his actions. I don't think he was ever a sociopath. I don't think he is cold and inhuman during Snake Eater. But I don't think he was fully integrating his actions. He was compartmentalizing, which is a very common thing for soldiers to do, because, I mean, how the hell can you pull the trigger when you look into the eyes of your enemy and you think, oh, this Vietnamese boy is just a boy. He has a mother. He has friends. No, you can't. And Marlantes goes into great detail about that. It is impossible. As an adult, reflecting on his time in Vietnam, he is haunted by thinking, my God, that was just a boy like my own son that I have now. As the boss says, he is just a child. He has not yet found an emotion to carry into battle. And so, yeah, I think he has not fully grasped for him personally what war means to him. It is just his job. It is the thing he enjoys doing because he is good at it. However, it's kind of ironic coming from the Joy. She was the Joy. And that makes me wonder, what kind of woman was she on the battlefield? We only ever know the boss as this serious, hard-ass woman who never smiles, who is quite melancholy and contemplative. But apparently she was once out there, joyfully killing. And then apparently, once she went up into space, her perspective on the world and war changed. So did Jack know both sides of this woman? And was joy her true emotion in battle? Or was that her compartmentalizing? Was that really her understanding the full scope of her actions? We'll get up to this with the Cobra unit. Each one of them have based their perspective of war on their attribute. However, the joy does not exemplify joy. And that is fascinating. Honestly, if I didn't have a million other creative projects going on, I would love to just write a biography about the boss. She's fascinating.
I do whatever I have to get the job done. I don't think about politics.
That's not the same thing. Sooner or later, your conscience is going to bother you. In the end, you have to choose whether you're going to live as a soldier or just another man with a gun. There's a saying in the Orient, loyalty to the end. Do you know what it means?
Being patriotic.
It means devoting yourself to your country.
First of all, there is no such saying that exists outside of this game. However, it may be an allusion to the Bushido Code, the samurai code, if you will. But here we get the boss saying directly that her greatest loyalty lies with her country, not with Snake, nor with anyone or anything else. So I guess the lyrics are wrong. I give my life not for honor, but for you. Unless the you in question is America.
I follow the president and the top brass. I'm ready to die for them if necessary.
The president and the top brass won't be there forever. Once their terms are up, others will take their place.
I follow the will of the leader, no matter who's in charge.
So Snake claims he doesn't care who's in charge. He doesn't care about the politics. He just follows the mission. He just wants to be a soldier and fight. This is his job. He's just doing the 9 to 5. If the boss tells you to do this or do that, whatever. I'm getting paid. And I'd say that's because he knows no other way of living. He is a career soldier. We don't know much about his childhood, but it seems like he was raised unconventionally. Did he even have parents? It's never mentioned. He may have been a child soldier. I guess he was. He was 15 years old in Korea. I don't think he really had much of a civilian life or really got to establish his identity outside of the army. And you do notice this, especially with very young recruits. They go immediately from high school to military life, and then once they retire or they leave for other reasons, they don't know what to do with themselves. It's a totally different way of living. Civilian culture and military culture have almost nothing in common.
People aren't the ones who dictate the missions.
Then who does?
The times. People's values change over time, and so do the leaders of a country. So there's no such thing as an enemy in absolute terms. The enemies we fight are only enemies in relative terms, constantly changing with the times.
And this is something we will return to in Peace Walker. Big Boss and Kaz will talk about this very thing. The times are the enemy. And Snake and Kazuhira begin as enemies, then become allies, then become enemies again. And then become allies again? I have no idea. I just think it would be interesting. Kind of ties into this theme if they end up on the same side. And also, I like when everyone's friends. Why has everyone got to be fighting all the time?
As long as we have loyalty to the end, there's no point in believing in anything, even in those we love.
And that's the way a soldier's supposed to think.
The only thing we can believe in with absolute certainty is the mission, Jack.
All right, but do me a favor.
What is it?
Call me Snake.
Snake. Oh, right. Your code name is Snake. It suits you well.
This is her parting wisdom. She's preparing Snake for her eventual betrayal and death. She would know more than anyone that there is no such thing as an enemy in absolute terms. She was recently forced to kill the Sorrow, and before that abandoned her son. This is a woman who was rarely, if ever, allowed to have anything for herself. Of course she's had to harden her heart and put aside her personal feelings. She was once the joy. Maybe war was once just a game to her. A rich girl, a daughter of one of the philosophers, allowed to cut loose and give in to her bloodlust, maybe. We'll never know. And with that, over and out.
After all, who knows if either of us will make it out alive?